Hello, everyone. This is Mark Vina with More Insights and Strategy. Today is Monday, April 27th. It's so significant for so many reasons, not the least of which is we're on day, 53, 54, 55, depending on where you live in the middle of the COVID-19 quarantine. I like to say, like I did last week during my podcast, that I think I see light at the end of the tunnel. Things are, I think, looking a bit brighter. I think there is room for optimism, and I, like many people, I'm glad we're hopefully coming to the end of this, because as you can see in my background, I'm a New York Yankee fan. I'm going to bring up a non-New York Yankee fan in about 30 seconds, who will share his wallpaper in the background. But I'd like to spend today's podcast talking about a variety of different topics, a lot of hot consumer tech topics bouncing around, not the least of which is work from home. Work from home has been a big topic I've been talking about for the last few weeks. But there's a lot of very, very interesting topical consumer topics that I'd like to address. And I am very, very fortunate to bring up a guy that I've known for many, many, many years, and that's Walt Mossberg, the esteemed Wall Street Journal journalist. He's done a variety of different things. You know him from a variety of different venues that he's been involved. Walt, please introduce yourself to the More Insights and Strategy audience.
Well, like you said, I'm Walt Mossberg. I spent 22 years as a tech columnist, the tech columnist at the Wall Street Journal, and then was the founder of All Things Digital, the conferences, the website, and then went on with my partner, business partner, Kara Swisher. We left the Journal. We started Recode. We sold that to Vox. Recode continues under Vox, and I retired a couple of years ago, but remain very active in tech topics. And like Mark says, I've known him for a long time. And despite our differences in baseball and sports fandom, I consider him a close friend. And I want to start the podcast by saying happy birthday to Mark, because today is his 80th birthday, and he's probably thinking about the time he saw the 1927 Yankees.
I did. I was there for Babe Ruth's 60th home run, if you recall. I was there personally.
I can see you in the pictures. Yeah.
Well, I'm wearing my little my Yankee T-shirt, but just to upset you during the call, Walt, and I know you were going to wear.
Yeah, I'm over it. I'm over it, Mark.
I'm glad we got past that. So
I got I got Fenway Park behind me.
I know. Isn't it amazing how people kind of revert back to the things they love? And I know how passionate you are about the Red Sox, and obviously you know how passionate I am about the Yankees. But it kind of gives us a little bit of optimism about the future when we think about the things that we love so much. Well, first and foremost, how have you been dealing with how have you been spending your almost 2 months in captivity, at home? Let's talk a little bit about that.
It's actually been better than I thought it would be. I have a wonderful wife, and she's with me, and we don't have the added pressure that a lot of people have of trying to do a full-time job and homeschool young kids. Our kids are grown up. We have grandchildren. They're homeschooling theirs. One of our kids is expecting shortly, and we're a little worried about what that will be like during the pandemic. But in our personal case, we've had the very good fortune of having a wide variety of delivery services here I live in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., in the state of Maryland, and our governor, who is a Republican, who's the chairman of the head of the National Governors Association this year. His name is Larry Hogan. He's done I think a very good job, and coordinating also, of course, with the nearby, those who know Washington know it's really 3 jurisdictions. It's the city of the District of Columbia and Virginia and Maryland. They're all coordinating closely. So we've been lucky. We've had things delivered that we've needed, and we've had neighbors who have been friendly and offering to shop for us and do us favors. And we do get to get out and walk, and been watching plenty of TV and reading books and doing Zoom conversations with friends and Zoom book clubs. And my wife does Zoom Zumba exercise. And we also both do kind of a Zoom physical therapy, if you can imagine that term. We have had a long time physical therapist who helps us with just general exercise and stretching and that kind of thing, and some meditation. And so she's basically directing us over Zoom at home. And it's been really, really helpful. Which brings me to the first thing I think we ought to talk about, and that
Sure.
is Zoom. Zoom is one of these products that rides on top of the web. It's not fundamental tech, but it's a service that rides on top of the web and the internet. And I did the first review of it. I was the first journalist to write about it and the first journalist to test it back in 2012. And I went back and read the column a little while ago, and my take on it was that, contrary to the way at the time Skype was, and there weren't really many others out there, Zoom offered free, high quality video calls with up to 15 people. And then they had some paid business plans, but there was a bigger consumer focus at the beginning. This is not unusual, as you know. They still have a consumer plan, although now it's limited, I think, to 40 minutes. They may have lifted that.
I think it's 45 or 40 minutes for for video calls, but there's a number of features you cannot utilize, like recording and things like that. You need to pay.
Right, but I think they may have even limited the 40 minutes. They have lifted the 40 minutes during the pandemic. You'd have to check. Yeah, I mean, like all these other products that have a consumer tier and then some business tiers, there obviously are more features. You're recording this call, and the free one doesn't let you do that.
What's your take on Zoom regarding the and it's been more than a brouhaha on the security related issues, because there are some significant security issues which they're in the process of addressing. They haven't totally addressed them.
Right, and the reason I should point out that the reason I'm looking away for a minute is I'm recording this on my phone at your request, so and I forgot to do that at the start. My take on their security and privacy issues that they had is, first of all, they should have been smarter about not doing it. I know the founder, he's a good guy, I think, and I don't think he's some evil guy, but I think they saw it as, hey, this is an enterprise thing. It's going to be controlled by the IT people at the company. We're not hiding this, but this is another revenue stream for us, like tying in when people sign in with Facebook, like every other company whose users sign in with Facebook, a certain amount of data goes to Facebook. I think the thing that I'm most disappointed about is that they had bugs that were pointed out to them, vulnerabilities, and they didn't fix them. They were just very lazy about fixing them. They're obviously they're on I guess it's I don't know where they are, but they're in a 90-day drive to close every hole and change. And they've already changed a whole bunch of policies. Like even for this, where we know each other and there's only the two of us, I was in a waiting room before I could get in here. That's now a new mandatory feature, so that if somebody wanted to crash this,
They can't. Yeah.
you would see them in the waiting room and you would not let them in.
Right.
And there's also default. I think these default to on, but there are toggles which say only the host can share a screen, only the host can do what's called annotating, which is one of the business features, where if you have a spreadsheet or a PowerPoint or something up on the screen, I might be able to annotate it as one of the participants. You can stop non-authenticated people from doing that. There's passwords. It's a bunch of things. So they're having to very quickly catch up, and they shouldn't have had to catch up, but they never were prepared to go from 10 million active users to 300 million active users in 1 month.
Right. And,
so,
and that brings up, I think, a larger issue, Walt, in that when you look at what's happened to the country, what's happened to the world, from a pandemic standpoint, and the fact, what really warms my heart, and I'm sure it does yours, is how the country has really come together respecting these quarantines. Really, the vast majority of Americans have really complied with their governors. They've complied with all the recommendations and suggestions by Dr. Fauci, Dr. Birx, and I really think it warms my heart that most of the country has signed up for that. But let me ask you a philosophical question. Without all the technology that we've had, whether it's Zoom, other video conferencing solutions, can you hear me, by the way, Walt?
I can, yes.
Okay, yeah, I thought you went out for a second.
I was taking my AirPods out so that the recording on the iPhone would
go. And I think the thing that I wonder is that and I mean this in a somewhat sarcastic way, would the country have been able to maintain its sanity with all this working from home? Well, first of all, there's a productivity piece. Could you really work from home without all this technology? Has technology given us the avenue to deal with this pandemic in a much more robust, and not that it hasn't disrupted our lives, it has disrupted our lives, but it's gone smoother because of the presence of all this technology that we've had the ability to have at our fingertips, unlike 20 years ago. I mean, or 10 years ago, you wouldn't even had some of the stuff that we have available.
Yeah,
today.
no, look, I completely agree with you. I tweeted something about it the other day. I actually think there are some interesting essays to be written about this.
Mm-hmm.
I think the presence of the video communication technology we have, which includes everything from the increase in capacity and speed on the internet itself to the abilities and characteristics of laptops, iPads, smartphones have been, and then of course the software products have been really important. I do think it's important to point out that only 30 or 40% of the workforce, by the nature of their jobs or by the technology they own because of their incomes, have the ability to do this work from home and this virtual stuff like we're doing. And the rest of the workforce are either essential, their jobs make it essential that they be somewhere in person, or they don't have bandwidth, or they don't have the devices. On one of our walks, and we live in a relatively well-off suburb, not a super rich place, but a middle class, upper middle class suburb. We took a walk, and our elementary school, they had a crew of people in masks and gloves and protective gear, and I asked what they were doing because the school has been closed for weeks or a month, and they said, we're passing out Chromebooks. And kids who didn't have computers or whatever was necessary for, I guess they're using Google Classroom or whatever at the school system here, which you don't need a Google product to use, but they're passing out Chromebooks, and that's not here in Maryland. That's not the only place that's going on. So they're trying to get this stuff out to as many people as possible, but not everybody can have it. Having said that, I totally agree with you that without a question, 20 years ago, this would have been a much harder thing, both for disease control, because people would have been much less able to isolate
Yes.
themselves, self-isolate, self-quarantine. And then economically, I think we would have lost more of the economy. And you might say, well, if we've lost 50% of the economy, how much difference does it make if we gain back the other 50% or the other 40%, whatever? But I think it's a huge difference.
Mm-hmm.
Every day, people, both of us know, including you, I'm retired, but not you, are going to work.
Right.
And you're able to go to work. And there's some things you might get done that you can't get done, but I'll bet 80-90% of your work you're able to, in your particular job, you're able to get done virtually, and that's important. I mean, the conferences and things like that, and I know a lot about that because I produced them for many years. The conferences that you would have gone to are canceled, so you're not missing them, and so minus that, you're getting a lot of work done.
Well,
yeah, I think tech has been huge, and I think that's true here. That's true in Europe. It's true in some of the richer places in South America. Certainly in Japan and parts of China and South Korea and places like that. Obviously, there are poor countries all over the world and poor parts of the rich countries where it's not helpful, but it's been a big deal.
Well, you raised a number of interesting points during your reply to that, Walt. But what's fascinating to me, and it kind of segues into a couple other things I want to dig into, is that I've been working from home in my current job for the last couple of years, and had fielded an enormous number of calls and requests from people for recommendations on how to work at home, what's the right equipment to get. Because strangely enough, when you're working from home for an extended period of time, if you haven't done it for an extended period of time, there is certain tips, frankly, that are helpful to people. And I know you're not new to the work from home. Even when you were working in an office in Washington, D.C. at the Journal, you did a lot of your work at home. So you were prepared.
I would spend a couple of days a week working at home. Yeah.
Home. What are the most common? Because I'm sure you still get questions and queries from family members and from other people you've worked with, or just people that may reach out to you randomly. Are you giving them any tips? Not specific on brands of equipment. Maybe you do that, but in just terms of, hey, here are the couple of things you want to think about, if you're going to work from home for an extended period of time,
Well, yeah. I mean, there are many, many articles and videos about this on the web, but I think, boundaries are probably the most important thing. Having a sense that I'm now going to work and I'm now going to lunch. Mm-hmm. I might go out for lunch. I might have lunch at home, but I'm going out. I'm going to lunch. And that's just like going to lunch if you were at an office. And then I'm going back to work. And then I'm being done with work. Although in our world, even if you never worked a minute at home, it's pretty hard to be done with work.
Yes. It follows you. Given
the way it follows you. But I think those boundaries, just mentally, just for your sanity and also for your productivity and concentration and for your attention to your family or your personal life, make sense. And I think that's the most important thing. There are equipment issues, and given my job and my career, I do get asked, what laptop would be good. Should I buy a microphone? I'm not using it, but I have a microphone here, and kind of a semi-professional microphone, because I used to do my own podcast. Depending what you're doing, you might want that. I notice you're using over-the-ear headphones, and I was using AirPods until I started doing a backup recording. And but but even the backup recording, you have to have a good phone for that. And
Right. Mm-hmm.
so there's some equipment you're going to need. I don't think you have to spend a huge fortune, but there is some equipment you need. But mostly I think you need a mindset of this is actual real work. And then there are parts of the day when I'm actually, even though I'm home, I'm not going to be at work. I also think you need a space in your house.
Yes. 100% agree with that. Yes.
I
You need a home office.
I have a home office. Maybe you do too.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have a home office, doesn't matter. You just, whether it's a corner with a table or a part of the kitchen counter or whatever it is, that is your regular place to work, unless you're somebody who likes to move around, which is also legitimate. But you need either a pattern of places where you work or a single place where you work. All of that, I think, helps you get in the mindset for working from home.
And that brings up a fascinating topic, because you did a tweet about this a week or so ago, and you would talk, and I agree with the assertion you made. It was first of all, the assertion you made about Apple's marketing has been kind of confusing about the iPad as a computer, because it segues into another topic I want to talk about, and that the question I get repeatedly, and I think I give them an answer that I think you would sympathize with, is, can I really use an iPad as my home productivity system in replacement of a laptop? And I think, and you've made this observation as well, is those of us in the tech space, unfortunately, sometimes we extrapolate our experience and our unique usage models with equipment on the general population, which is kind of for me, a very arrogant thing to do. And I do it. Sometimes I do it just because that's my orientation, but I try to take myself out of that. And I find that, with the huge, advantages, not advantages, but advances that Apple has implemented in iPad OS, with now trackpad and mouse control and other things they've done as well, the iPad can become a very, very effective laptop replacement. And I think you made the point that sometimes Apple's marketing seems to be very confused about that. They don't seem to really want to, they hint at that, but they don't really pitch the iPad as a complete replacement for the PC. So I want to talk a little about that from your perspective, in terms of the iPad as with the right keyboard. They have now a Magic Keyboard that has a built-in trackpad. Do you think that most consumers can get away with using a nice iPad Pro and a few other things as an effective laptop replacement?
I do, but I would not call it a laptop replacement. I would not use that term. I think what it does is it replaces many, in some cases, most of the scenarios, the usage scenarios, where you would have a grab for your laptop. Over the 10 years that the iPad has been out, and starting really from my very first column, where I made this exact point, so many of the scenarios, like the thing we're doing now, I don't happen to be doing this on an iPad, but I did a podcast the other day where I just used my iPad Pro instead of a Mac. I'm on a Mac. You may be on a Dell. I don't know what you're on, but we could both be on iPads, and the cameras are fine, and the quality is fine, and the processors are actually faster than on almost any laptop. So the answer is we've gotten to the point now, whether you have a keyboard or even if you don't have a keyboard, the keyboard stand or a third-party keyboard, it absolutely is a productivity device. It absolutely can do you can do your work on it, and not on a laptop. You will immediately on Twitter hear from people who are obviously developers or video editors or something like that, who will say, well, I can't do that. How can you say that? I can't do blah, 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 coding this and developing that. And look, I have a lot of respect for those people. I'm not trying to make fun of them, but I think they can't see past their own workflow.
No, I agree with that.
I was, you might have been in the room at the time in the audience, and I was on stage right next to him when Steve Jobs gave his famous explanation about cars and trucks.
Trucks, yes.
And he said in the post-PC world, which he believed we were entering, the iPad and the smartphone, by the way, would be devices that would resemble what cars came to be. And we would still need trucks, just like we still need trucks. We all have a lot of trucks on our roads because there are things trucks can do that cars can't do. And so he never, to my recollection, said the iPad can totally replace the laptop. They make laptops. They did before he passed away. If you go way back to his introduction of the iPad, he clearly made it a third category, not a replacement of the laptop category. So it doesn't replace the laptop. What it does is replace a lot of the usage scenarios. And I mean, I grab for my laptop maybe 20% of as often as I used to. I just grab iPad Pro instead, and I'm talking about not even the huge one, just a 10 and a half.
The 11-inch or the small one, right?
iPad Pro. I use an iPad Mini to do certain things, and these are work things. If somebody tells you that email or texting or annotating a document or working on Google Docs or something like that isn't work, but only editing a video or coding that an app is work, they're just wrong. That may be true for them, but these things are work.
So, if this is all, and I believe this is all true, I think that I would agree with you violently on all of this. And I know this is probably speculation. Then how do you explain? Because a lot of the Apple folks, you still talk to some of the Apple folks. Of course, you don't talk to Steve anymore, but you still, I'm sure, occasionally interact with some Apple folks. How do you explain the marketing? Because I don't really quite understand it myself. I mean, from a business perspective, as I was telling you, is I think they want to have their cake and eat it too, because they still sell lots of MacBooks and they still sell lots of iMacs, and I don't think they're prepared to make that dramatic statement the way I phrased it, not the way you phrased it.
No, in fact, as you know, and we could even talk about this. They're planning on not only not ceasing making laptops and desktop, but they're planning on migrating them to ARM to the same really fast chip that's completely within their control that they're using on their mobile devices. So the Mac has a future and a long future in their mind. Here's what I think is going on. They wanted to make the point that an iPad is a computer. Now it's obviously a computer. My Apple Watch and maybe your Apple Watch is a computer. Our phones are computers, whether they're Android phones or iPhones, whatever, they're computers. And there are a lot of things in our world that are computers other than the old idea of a PC, a personal computer, whether it's Windows or Mac, in the shape of a laptop clamshell or in the shape of a desktop. Those compact towers used to come and talk to me about when you worked there in those Dell towers. Those things were clearly personal computers. I think Apple's trying to say the iPad, particularly with the iPad OS and some of the improvements you talked about, is a computer. The problem is they're not saying personal computer. They're saying when is a computer not a computer or something like that, whatever their ad copy is. And I think that's what's really confusing about it. I think if they were saying this is a personal computer, that would be a much clearer expression of what I think they're trying to say. And I will go further without regard to Apple, because I don't talk to them about their ad copy. I do talk to them, as you say, and I talk to people at other companies as well. But I would say that the personal computer that we always thought of as the personal computer, the laptop I'm on, right now, for instance, is no longer the most personal computer. The most personal computer is your smartphone.
Phone.
And for a lot of people, the iPad is their personal computer in terms of how often they use it, how close it is to them, that kind of thing. I think we've seen that change. We are in the post-PC era, but it's only PC in the sense that that's the abbreviation we used to use for the particular kind of computer that is a laptop or a desktop.
Right.
The phone, we call it, it's hilarious that we call it a phone because putting aside the need for human contact during the pandemic, in most of the time when we're not in the middle of a pandemic, we're not making that many voice phone calls on the thing compared to other things we're doing. It's a computer. It happens to be small enough to fit in a purse or a pocket, and an iPad is a computer. A Surface tablet is a computer. And so I think these are the real personal computers of this century and the latter part of the last century, decade. Well, this century.
Well, and and the other interesting thing is, and I think we should talk about this for a couple of minutes, is that the move for Apple to their own ASICs, their ARM-like solutions, but their own CPUs, is significant for a couple of reasons. I mean, not only will allow them to optimize the operating system, from which is really the wonderful thing they've done with iPads and with phones, is that their ASICs are so well optimized and integrated from an operating standpoint, allows them to create a very immersive, highly beneficial experience for consumers. From a developer standpoint, if they're able to get their entire client line, their PC, their notebook line, their iMac line, their iPads and phones on the same architectures from an ASIC standpoint, the software implications of that are very significant, from an app standpoint. Because first of all, if you're a developer, most developers, they bristle at the fact, I've got to develop my application for 5 or 6 different platforms. Many developers they don't have tons and tons of resources. So the advantage of being able to combine that code base ultimately and allow them to develop, take that same application and put it on more platforms is a big deal. So what are your thoughts on just that?
I totally agree with you. They already have a fledgling program to put iPad apps on Macs running Intel. And it's, a little ragged. It's not great. Presumably they could make it better, but I think it's kind of a Trojan horse for the time when the same processor will be running in the iPad and the Mac, and it would be so much easier and so much better for the iPad app to run on the Mac. Might imply, by the way, a touchscreen Mac, which is oh my God.
Oh, that's heresy. That's heresy.
That might imply that. And I have no inside knowledge on that. But I think it's, and going back to the oldest days we can think of Apple, they've always wanted to control the whole stack.
Yes.
And that's not to say they don't allow millions of third-party apps on these devices, but they exercise some control over the parameters of that too. So they like control and they like consistency, and already their devices work better together than I think any family of devices on anybody else's ecosystem, Windows or Android. The Apple ecosystem just interoperates beautifully. I mean, my wife was doing her Zoom dance class this morning off her new iPhone SE, which costs, by the way, $399, and airplane through the Apple TV onto a 65-inch LG OLED
display. TV. Yeah. But let's talk about that, because I think that kind of goes to one of the points you were making earlier, that the new SE phone that just came out, you just got one for your wife. Interestingly enough, I mean, it's not a cheap iPhone. It's an inexpensive iPhone that actually has a lot from a technology standpoint. It's using the latest ASIC or the latest ASIC technical term. It's
We
using the
keep
latest
saying
CPU.
ASIC, but it's really a
CPU. Right.
It's really a system on a chip.
Yes, it's their own. It's the same processor. They well, not the same. It's a new version of it, but they're using the latest and greatest technology. That's my point from a processor
Okay.
standpoint.
I'm going to take off my virtual background for a minute.
Go ahead.
So that I can show this to you. My wife let me borrow this for this podcast. So this is it. Now you're going to say it doesn't look much different than, let's say, an iPhone 8, a little bit older iPhone, although the red's pretty great, I think. It's an extremely solid build. It's nothing cheap. There's nothing plastic here.
Mm-hmm.
The camera is excellent. So here's the deal. It's essentially, and I just read an iFixit teardown on it just like 3 or 4 hours ago. The body is the body of an iPhone 8. The camera hardware is either the iPhone 8 or the iPhone XR camera.
Right.
But they have the 813 Bionic chip in here, which is the same chip that's in my iPhone 11 Pro, which I paid well over $1,000 for. Blinging it out. And this thing, I did throw in another $50 to double the store. So this cost $450, which is roughly a third of what I paid for my phone, and it has the same processor, exactly, right up to date. That has two big meanings. One is computationally, this thing is super fast, super fluid, and in terms of the camera, even though the camera hardware isn't anything as good as what I have or you might have, this thing does portrait mode.
That's a very capable phone.
Google has done the same thing with a single camera phone, and Apple is doing it now. So she went from a 2016 SE 4-inch phone with what by now looks like a pretty crappy camera to this, which is not the best camera on an iPhone, which is probably right now the
11
best
Pro
on a smartphone,
mm-hmm.
but a very, very, very good camera. And the other thing is, because it's the newest system on a chip, it means that it's going to get 4 or 5 years of
runway,
of updates, and that's for $399, or in my case $450. But it's astonishingly inexpensive for a very good iPhone. And so Apple obviously started planning this 6, 8, 10 months ago, long before the pandemic, but bringing this out during the pandemic, particularly given the production delays and so forth they're having with the next group of premium phones that are coming, I think is very fortunate for them, because while I don't know, what I'm about to say is just speculation, my guess is the margin on this is pretty darn good, because all of the parts in this
are common,
all sunk costs.
Right.
They even made a statement when somebody said, well, people love that, SE owners love that 4-inch screen. How are they going to do with a 4.7-inch screen, which, by the way, is the smallest screen you can imagine getting today on a brand name, big name, tier 1 phone. And Apple said, we've sold 500 million phones with a 4.7-inch screen, is, the way I calculate it, not far off from half of all the iPhones they've sold. What have they sold? 1.2 billion iPhones, something like that. So 500 million is a lot. So the screen's beautiful. It's not OLED, but it's beautiful. The camera's good. The processor is the best in any phone by any company, and the build quality is terrific. And it's $399.
Right. Well,
That's a
and
great product for them to have right now.
I want to go back to something when you said a few minutes ago, is that having the fastest processor in that actually is important, because with WWDC coming up in the not too distant future, and it's going to be their first virtual event, by the way, and just on the event itself, I think it will be interesting, because that event's always been held in San Jose. Thousands of developers show up. And this is going to be the first virtual WWDC because of the pandemic. It'll be remarkable the way Apple does it. I mean, just purely from an event standpoint, I am sure Apple will do it with the precision of a Broadway show. And it will be a great teaching lesson for the rest of the tech world on how to conduct an event like that. Not just the keynotes, but the breakouts and things like that. But the point I'm making, they typically announce their new upcoming operating system for the smartphones and for tablets. And I am sure there's going to be a lot of surprises. There typically is. Some of the stuff has been speculated of what they'll be incorporating with that. There'll be more AR, presumably more VR functionality built into that. And having the fastest CPU in that phone you just showed off is a pretty important part. So they do everything for a reason from a sequencing standpoint. So I agree with what the general comments you've made about the phone, but it's also to me, a future-proofing point that if you buy that phone, it will last you for quite some time.
Yeah, so if we're entering a world, and we are, with huge, horrible unemployment, even if we get some of that back as we reopen the economy, which I think, by the way, is going to take most of the rest of this year, not a matter of weeks.
Mm-hmm.
If we reopen the economy, we're still going to have much higher unemployment than we had before the pandemic hit, but hopefully, God willing, we'll have much less unemployment than we have now. People are still going to be not necessarily in the mood to buy these $1,000 phones, whether it's Apple or Samsung or
whatever.
Top of the line, Pixel or whatever, the rumored new Surface phone. Whatever it is, if it's, in a way, Apple has set a new price for this, even if that wasn't their intention. In the world we're in now, the price is, holy
moly.
I can get a pretty great iPhone for $400.
Right.
And by the way, I would throw into that, it's not quite as dramatic, but it's pretty dramatic. They brought out a brand new MacBook Air with a finally fixed keyboard,
mm-hmm.
And all the other advantages of a MacBook Air, and they cut the price to $999. So you can get, if you want that, that's now less expensive than it was. So again, I'm not saying they planned all this because of the pandemic situation and the economic situation we're in, but it's going to help them.
Well, in a few minutes we have left, what's your take on 5G? I mean,
5G is not. It's not even worth thinking about this year.
Really, you feel that strongly about that? You think it's not a consideration?
I feel that strongly about it, Mark. I think it's another one of these things where tech writers should be covering it. Tech analysts should be covering it, and I don't object to anybody covering it, but I don't think it's a this year thing for the vast majority of people. First of all, the vast majority of people won't have devices capable of using it, phones in particular capable of using it. They won't live in places which are covered by it. This year,
mm-hmm.
the pandemic has, if anything, slowed it down, the deployment of it, and slowed down the willingness. We just got finished talking about this, but slowed down the willingness of people to buy the new generation of phones that have 5G. I don't care what brand. We can stop talking about Apple and only talk about Samsung. It doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
The Samsung is not putting 5G on their $399 phone. They're putting it on their $1,000 phone, just like Apple, just like OnePlus, just like the Google Pixel. So you think those things are going to sell in the amount they were going to sell in this year? I don't.
Yeah, I wasn't going there, though. Where I was going with is if Apple will have a flagship phone later this year. But I don't think
and maybe I'll buy it. Maybe I might not, but you might.
But I don't think I could tell a person go spend $1,500 on a phone without having 5G from a future-proofing standpoint. That's the point I'm making. I think the point you're making is relevant from those people who are looking for a budget phone, and I agree with everything you said. But I think if you're going to spend $1,200, $1,300, $1,400, $1,500, which these the Apple flagship phones phones float in that category, it'd be really hard to buy a version of that without 5G.
Well, I think we're going to have to look at the prices. The rumors are they're going to have 4 flagship phones.
Yeah.
Not 3. It may be that the least expensive one, the $700 one or whatever, won't have 5G. Maybe they'll all have 5G and they won't, for some reason, charge for it. I don't know. Just because of the pandemic and the economic situation, they may decide to swallow that and swallow a little bit of the margin. I simply don't know. But even if you bought one, I don't think it's going to make a big difference in your daily life. I don't think we're there yet. I think it's a 2021 thing, not in terms of its existence, but in terms of its actual impact on your life. And if we think about deployment and we think about deployment of devices.
And the infrastructure, I can't disagree with you.
I want to say I don't think 5G causes coronavirus, and I wouldn't be. Well, you laugh, but at least in the UK,
I know
what they call masts. The masts for 5G, and so I'm all for 5G. I'm all for progress. There's also, even if we didn't have a pandemic and none of this was going on, as well as I do, that there are serious questions about 5G actually changing things a whole lot for the typical person and what the typical person does. I mean, it gives you more capacity, but it doesn't necessarily, in every instance, give you more speed, depending where you are. You may have already enough speed, or whatever. So, and it's not going to help people in rural areas who are already having trouble with LTE.
Yeah, I know. I think, I'd love that we should have we only have a couple of minutes left here, that we need to have a 5G specific conversation maybe a couple of months from now, because I think that the world will be a bit different, hopefully, then in terms of discussing it. But I do think that, you've made some very good points. Again, I look at it from a kind of a value standpoint. Do you want to spend that kind of money for a high-end phone? But you're right. I mean, 5G is going to be rolled out in different flavors. There's millimeter wave, which is not going to be represented the entire 5G rollout. That's where you get the performance speed. And there will be parts of the country that will not have that millimeter wave infrastructure in place. So you're right. You might not be able to take advantage of that even with 5G. But in the couple minutes I have left, Walt, anything that you else like to kind of opine about? Anything that was on your radar?
I do want to say that I think all of us who are tech analysts or tech journalists or retired tech journalists, whatever I am, I think we have to give credit to Google and Apple for doing the joint work they're doing on contact tracing in a very serious way, with white papers and lots of privacy, lots of thought that went into, in a very short time, lots of very clever thought that went into layers of privacy and the things they're doing. And this is both the first stage, which is the APIs for apps to be written by the government. And I can only go apps written by the government, but but more importantly, the second stage, which I expect to see in the early summer, which is just a toggle in the OS itself, where as long as you opt in,
you'll have access to that capability.
A lot of contact tracing can go on. Obviously, it depends on whether people are willing to use it, willing to report that they believe they've had COVID, and all of that. But I think it bodes well. I don't think there's been this cooperation between Apple and Google since the early days of Google Maps and YouTube on the early iPhones. And, you can still be competitors and that's good for the world. But when you need to have every phone be able to do this, it's great that Sundar Pichai and Tim Cook and their top people underneath them were willing to all get together and do this. And I feel like we need to say that.
No, I think you're right. It's unfortunately that it took a pandemic to force that kind of cooperation together, but they are natural competitors, let's face it. But I do think there's a lot of examples of that, not just the Apple-Google cooperation, but being out here in the Valley, it's really been unbelievable. We've written about this at Moor Insights in terms of how many of the high-tech companies have stepped up in a pretty big way in terms of trying to do their very best in terms of providing their technology and capability to help, mitigate this, the COVID-19 stuff. So that's, to me, heartwarming, and it makes me feel good about being part of the tech space. But thank you, Walt. This has been great. You look fine. I'm glad to know that your family is healthy. You're healthy. Hopefully we'll be out of our home soon, because I know the place you want to be is that background, but you don't want to be you don't want to just a virtual background.
I don't want to look at the stadium much longer. I'll look at you. I don't want to look at the stadium much longer.
Well, listen, thank you very much for participating in today's podcast. Thank you to the entire Moor Insights and Strategy podcast audience. Please follow us on social media, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And until next time, have a great weekend.